Okay, hello YouTube. This is going to be a continuation of my Open Sicilian series. My first video was an introduction to the Open Sicilian, an introduction to the ideas, to the concepts, and to, of course, all of the options that are kind of available to both sides, and mostly all of the options that are available to black, and how much theory you're really going to need to learn as white. In the first video, I covered a little bit of the Najdorf variation, and in this video, we're basically just going to do a deep dive into the Fischer Sozin variation of the Najdorf, and that's going to be the primary focus of this video, is just the Fischer Sozin variation. We're not going to be focusing on the classical, or the Svenigen, or any of the other transpositional lines, other than the lines that are independent Fischer Sozin variation lines. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and please click on your notification icon. So in the previous video, I gave kind of an overview of the typical types of sacrifices and the typical ideas within the Open Sicilian after all of these moves, and I gave an overview of all the options right here. But in this video, we're just going to be focusing on the Najdorf, and we're just going to be focusing on the Fischer Sozin variation. And again, we're going to be exclusively focusing on the main lines after e6 and bishop to b3. And as you can see, there are an awful lot of options here. So mainly, one of the main moves here is b5, and we touched on this in the last video. I showed a lot of the typical sacrifices. The main move that you want to play here is bishop g5, bishop e7, queen f3, and in the previous video we touched a lot on the move queen to c7, and we mentioned that there's two lines here with e5 and castle's queenside. Now I would say right now the main line is going to be castle's queenside, and you're going to meet b4 with the move knight to f5, which attacks the g7 square and takes advantage of the fact that the black king has yet to castle in this position. So if they castle instead in a position like this, what you would do is you would play the immediate e5, and you would attack here, and your intention is actually to sacrifice your queen. So after bishop b7, what you're going to do is you're going to continue with e takes f6, takes, rook over, takes, and not only do you have enough compensation for the queen sacrifice in this position is considered better for white according to theory. So after, for example, d5, the move knight takes e6 is really strong, knight d5, and that passed pawn is really difficult to deal with. Notice that we don't have e takes d5 because of bishop takes d5 hitting this, but also, threatening to push that pawn through as well. So something like this happened in Josh Friedel versus Yanat in Foxwoods in 2007, and this was the full point for white. So white was able to get his queen back, and then this endgame here is an easy win. So other than castles, the only other real option other than castles and b4, which are both lemons, we also have some other lemons here. Of course, the move bishop b7 is going to be instantaneously met with bishop e6, which is again one of those typical sacrifices discussed in the previous video. And after knight e6 followed by knight g7 to f5, this is a completely winning position for white. So knight on b to d7 is the main move, and I did point this out in the previous video, and I pointed out that the main line here is e5, and this kind of unceremoniously leads to a draw after some pretty serious complications. And, if you're playing against a grandmaster or something, or you just want to quiz somebody on their theory, because there are ways to go wrong, I mean, this is certainly acceptable. This is the main line currently, and there's not a lot of wiggle room here in terms of once you start diving into these complications. According to the engine, knight e6 is kind of forced. So once you play knight e6, the writing's on the wall as far as the perpetual goes. Basically, you've got a couple moves you can make, but in the end, you're just going to be shuffling between h5 and h3, and you're going to get your perpetual check, and that's going to be it. So the question is, how do you play if you don't want a perpetual? Like, what if you're playing against weaker competition? Or what if you're in a must-win situation? Or what if you just don't want to draw with white in general? What's your option against this knight on b to d7 move? Now, the answer is you don't have a ton of options. So my personal recommendation is just play the really solid rook he1 and just kind of ask black, what he's doing in this position. So I had a game against weaker opposition where I had to play rook he1, and my opponent played knight to c5, and I actually played a bit incorrectly in my game. I played bishop takes f6 first, and then I played knight f5, but it was actually much stronger just to play knight f5 right away. And it's just a very typical sacrifice in this position. Again, just taking advantage of the fact that this g7 pawn is hanging, and that we're going to occupy the d5 square if they take on f5. So ef5, bishop f6, knight takes, and then anything takes on f6, and then takes. This would be completely winning for white because, I mean, that's check, actually, and that's a hanging rook. And this knight is still coming to d5, so that's completely winning. If you want to see how I proceeded in the actual game, I played bishop f6, and then I played knight f5 anyway, so I basically played the same idea, but it's not quite as effective as it could have been. This is still a nice attack. It's basically a winning attack against this very misplaced king in the middle of the board, and I was able to make it work kind of in short order. I was able to break through against the king, which is just kind of what people do. In these positions, we just play for these blatant attacks, and we just play it for breakthroughs. And as you can see, I never quite let my position slip, and my opponent eventually blundered. And I mean, I guess he could just resign right, or I guess this was maybe his plan, was to sacrifice the queen for 2 pieces to try to survive, because I was coming in with pretty much everything at this point. I'm threatening rook here and a number of other things. So maybe this is just an attempt at trying to save from him, but it didn't work out very well. He just ended up throwing in the towel right here. So if you want to play for a win in that position, and you don't want to go into the line that's a forced draw and considered best according to the machines, my recommendation is that rook he1 move. There is one other alternative that's been tried by Despagne, which I think is very interesting, is after knight on b to d7, instead of e5 or rook he1, Despagne has actually played the move bishop f6 in this position, and he had similar success. After knight f6, he had a game go g4, and then his opponent preemptively retreated with knight d7, and then he sacked on e6, which, ended up being, spectacular for him. He ended up getting a great position with white, but those moves by no means are obligatory for black, but this is maybe another interesting way to play, is just taking on f6 and playing g4 and trying to play g5. Okay, so taking a deeper dive into the main lines of the Najdorf, we have to take a deeper dive into these other moves. We have to take a deeper dive into bishop e7, and we have to take a deeper dive into knight on b to d7. Now, as far as independent Najdorf lines go, I'm going to say that moves like knight c6 and bishop e7 are probably better covered in talking about the Sozin attack versus the Schengen or the classical. But of course there is some independent value to bishop e7, even in this position. But I would say the main alternative to b5 is going to be the move knight on b to d7. And of course the idea here is to immediately, ratchet up pressure with knight c5. Now with white, you have to be very cautious in these positions, because it's actually very easy to end up being strategically lost. And, I mean, the same is true for black. It's very easy to end up being strategically lost. But white's primary plan is either to play bishop g5 followed by f4, or simply to play f4 and f5 right away as quickly as possible. Now, when Fischer played this position, he would always play f4, f5 right away as quickly as possible. But I think in modern practice, the move bishop g5 is kind of taken over. And it's just that kind of classic super development kind of move. But also because there's a position within the f4, f5 complex that Fischer thought was good, and we now think is bad. So just to give you kind of an overview of that, is after, like, say, f4, and then say knight f5, and then say f5, and then bishop e7, queen f3, and then say something like, black just hanging back, playing something like queen c7, and then bishop e3, and then castles kingside, castles queenside. We used to think this was a-okay for white. As it turns out, this is probably just a very difficult position for white, as it turns out. Is if black just kind of maintains this pawn here indefinitely, it's actually very difficult for white to make progress in these castles queenside positions. It's actually much better if white castles kingside. And the reason it's much better if white castles kingside in these positions is because when this capture takes place on b3, we want to be able to actually recapture with the c pawn and not the a pawn. And of course, if we're castled kingside, that is a much better thing if we're castled kingside, because then we can immediately put a rook on the open file. And of course, more importantly, our king isn't over here, and it's not going to be in all this danger. Now we're going to be able to play a much more solid kind of positional game of chess. So the castle's kingside plans are kind of taking precedence these days, and because the castle's kingside plans are taking precedence, it makes more sense to actually put the bishop on g5 first, and then play f4, and then play queen f3, and then castle kingside, and then play f5. So this is just making a lot more sense in terms of what our plans are and what our strategies are. So one way that this could go is they could play knight takes b3 right away. Now, of course, it is possible to recapture with c captures b3, with previously stated plan. But there was one really good game that responded with a captures b3. So, like, another advantage of not being castled over here is we have the immediate open rook file. This makes it difficult to play a move like pawn to b5. And this was something that Alexander Shabalov was taking advantage of against Brooks in Stillwater in 2007. And he was playing the white pieces, and he was able to build up a pretty vicious kingside attack after king h1, queen h3, putting pressure on e6, and then Brooks is doing what makes sense at the time, which is just maintaining all of this tension so that he keeps a firm grip on the d5 square. But of course, this is another huge advantage to castling kingside, is it's actually, in a lot of ways, having this rook on the open f file makes it a lot easier to whip up an attack if black does nothing. If black sits back and hangs back and doesn't do anything with his material and just hangs onto that d5 square, it makes it easy to whip up an attack via kind of these rook lift ideas, rook f4, rook h4, etc. And that's exactly what happened a few moves down the road, is after black had basically denied white access to this d5 square, he whips up a huge attack with rook f4, and then he proceeds to bring all of his pieces into black's position and then just have a winning attack with rook lifts. So he was threatening rook h4, which is what caused all these exchanges, and now he just basically has a winning attack with the remaining rook lifts. He's threatening rook g3, queen h7, and rook h4 is a serious threat. So, for example, he could end the game like this. We would have takes, we would have rook g3, we would have here, and then queen takes h7, king takes h7, rook h4. Could have been the potentially beautiful finish to that game, if allowed, but of course it wasn't. So this is what we're doing here. We're putting pressure on this position, and what black should do here at this point is black needs to refrain from pushing this pawn and giving white a strategic advantage. So just simply put, if we play something like e5, we're gonna take bishop takes f6, takes, and since there's no check, we could actually play knight d5 right away. But it's not strictly necessary. We could also just retreat. We could play knight e2, and then, after we have something like this, we take back with the c pawn. This rook is coming to c1, this knight is coming to d5, this king is going to go to h1, and we can even shuffle this knight on g3 to h5. And then another thing that I've kind of discovered is usually as soon as this bishop on the f6 square moves, what we want to do is, no matter where it moves to, whether it's e7 or g5, we want to shove this pawn immediately, even if it's a sacrifice. Actually, possibly, especially if it's a sacrifice. We want to shove that pawn immediately, open up the f file, open up the f5 square, open up the king side. And this is usually advantage white. This is actually the reverse of the problem we were having before, where black was getting a strategic advantage against white by basically just sitting there with his pawn on e6 and not giving white a clear plan. In the castle's kingside lines, it's very easy for black to end up strategically lost, which is why castle's kingside is just a much better way to go. And, I really wish I'd known that, 20 years ago. But anyways, so instead of e5, probably the best move is going to be b5, again, trying to maintain this strategic tension and trying to keep white in a position where he could be strategic lost. But here white just does something kind of clever. Since he intends c captures b3 anyway, we're just going to play a3. And the whole point is since after knight b3, we're just going to play cb3, we have no problem with this pawn structure. We have no problem playing cb3. And then we just have a series of kind of stock moves that we can play after this. After something like, say, bishop d7, we're just going to continue with you bring in our rook on a to c1. We could also play rook a d1. I mean, there's just a number of very simple options here. You know, something like queen b6, we would simply play bishop e3. Queen b7, we would play pawn to b4. Rook a to e8, we would play rook f to d1. Pawn to h6, e5, we would exchange. And all of this stuff, at the end of the day, should be some sort of slight advantage, white. So this should be some sort of slight advantage white. And that's kind of how we need to play against the knight on b to d7 lines. So before I close this video, I'm just going to show one more very kind of trappy concept within the b5 lines that I didn't get a chance to cover in the previous two videos. But the thought occurred to me that this actually does happen quite frequently in my own games, so I'd like to mention it just so you can get that quick win if it comes up in your games. So I've had quite a few games go queen b6, and then castles queenside, and then queen b7. And I don't know why. I don't know why people do this. Clearly this is not home preparation, I wouldn't think, because the position is completely unsound. So if you've caught the theme of the last couple of like kind of sacrificial attacks, the big problem is, of course, this g7 pawn is loose, and the king hasn't castled yet, so the move knight f5 is definitely a go here. So after knight f5, we're going to play the move e takes f5, and then we're going to play bishop takes f6, and after bishop takes f6, we're going to play bishop to d5, and the whole point is after knight f6, we're not actually going to play, and this is a really critical moment where you do have to know what you're doing. We have all of this stuff lined up on everything, and it looks like e takes f5 is really the right idea. Unfortunately, it's not. The absolute correct idea is actually the move e5. And as long as you remember to make this move, pawn to e5, you're actually going to be okay. And there's actually this really clever rejoiner within this move. So, of course, I mean, I can point out the obvious. I can say, well, if knight takes, we're going to take here, of course. And then if knight takes f3, we obviously have this capture, and then this knight is still hanging. So we're getting all of our material back and then some. So we're doing pretty good right here. So that's fairly straightforward and fairly obvious. So the less obvious is how is this working? Like if bishop g5 check, we're just going to play king b1. And then it looks like on the surface that everything is held together because we have this extra move to defend this knight. We are threatening bishop d7, but we have this extra move to defend this knight. So the move bishop d7, defending the knight, looks like it holds it all together. We do actually have the move knight to e4. And if not for this move, we wouldn't be able to continue with the position. But this move threatens absolutely everything. And what's amazing about this move is there's no good move here for black. There's no refutation of this move. If we take the knight, which I guess he kind of has to, white basically whips up an incredible attack with queen f7, king over, and then queen g7 is going to be forking these two pieces. And then we're just going to continue attacking with just monumental amounts of force in this position. And white has got a huge advantage here. So that's how you meet that particular move, and that should kind of cover the main lines with the Fischer Sozin Najdorf variation. So in the next video, we're going to be covering the lines that are more of the Strenigan nature. We're going to be covering those early e6s, and also we're going to have to cover the classical at the same time we cover the Strenigan, because there's just a ton of crossover here. And I'll probably end up doing 2 or 3 videos on that. But these are the absolute tippy-top main lines of the Fischer Sozin variation in the Najdorf, the lines with b5 and the lines with knight on b to d7. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you for watching.